Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, March the 5th, 2015. We're 1 year beyond Thunderdome, and I want to thank people for sending me these two articles because there have been developments, mostly of a geopolitical nature, in the aftermath of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov in Russia. And as predicted, as predicted, we find both Russia and, of course, the United States accusing the other of what happened with Nemtsov. So let me read this first one from the Sydney Morning Herald. This is an article by Evgenia Pismanaya and Henry Meyer that ran in the Sydney Morning Herald today, but in Sydney, of course, that would be March 6th. Dateline Moscow. Russia's Security Council accused the United States of plotting to oust President Vladimir Putin by financing the opposition and encouraging mass demonstration less than a week after a protest leader was murdered near the Kremlin. The U.S. is funding Russian political groups under the guise of promoting civil society. Just as in the color revolutions in the former Soviet Union and the Arab world, the Security Council chief Nikolai Patrushev said on Wednesday. At the same time, the U.S. is using sanctions imposed over the conflict in the Ukraine as a pretext to inflict economic pain and stoke discontent. Now, skipping a few paragraphs. Listen, this is the Sydney Morning Herald now. Quote, the Russian-backed revolt in the Ukraine has led to the worst standoff between the Kremlin and the U.S. since its European allies since the end of the Cold War. The fighting has claimed at least 6,000 lives, according to the United Nations. Putin has repeatedly blamed the U.S. for inciting the protests in Kiev last year that toppled his ally, Viktor Yanukovych. The combination of U.S. and European sanctions over the fighting that ensued after Yanukovych's ouster and a plunge in oil prices is pushing the economy into recession for the first time in 6 years. The U.S. this week extended by a year the targeted sanctions it imposed in March over Russia's annexation of the Crimea from the Ukraine. The EU has prolonged similar measures by 6 months, and more comprehensive penalties on the energy and banking industries come up for renewal in July. Skipping. While Putin has condemned the brazen murder and vowed to find the culprits, Russia's leading opposition figure, Alexei Navalny, has accused the country's political leadership, including the president, of ordering the killing. Nemtsov had been planning to publish details about Russia's role in the conflict in the Ukraine. A prominent political analyst with ties to the Kremlin, Sergei Markov, blamed the Ukraine Secret Service and the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency for the crime, saying on his Facebook page that the goal was to provoke a popular uprising. Now let's stop before we continue with the second article. The Sydney Morning Herald is clearly pursuing the standard U.S. line that there was nothing untoward about the West's activities in the Ukraine, and that all the problems and all the fault for the situation lie solely on Russia's and therefore Mr. Putin's doorstep. Now, frankly, folks, as I've said many times before, this is simply an untruth. The Yankovic government was a legitimate government. The West did sponsor a coup against it, and therefore violated the very principles of international law they like to invoke on everybody else. So clearly there's a double standard. This is narcissism as geopolitics. We are the exceptional country. We can do what we want. We can break the law when we want, but everybody else has to play by our rules. Now, clearly that's not a situation designed for any sort of geopolitical stability. The West has sponsored movements of secession in other countries before, and there's no idea that this was wrong, and therefore I think it was fully within Russia's sphere of interest. I think it was acceptable for them to respond to the call for Russian help in the Crimea. And that wasn't going to happen anyway, simply on a purely geopolitical basis. Sevastopol in the Crimean Peninsula is the home base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, has always been, and to expect that Russia was simply going to play along and let their prime naval base go to the West was simply, that was a fool's errand from the beginning. So, whether we like it or not, the Russians do have a legitimate geopolitical interest in the Ukraine. Now, I've said all along something else. The idea that we're seeing a full-fledged Russian invasion of the eastern Ukraine, to me, again, makes no sense. If we were seeing a full-scale military invasion, we'd be seeing something very different from what we're seeing. Now, I have no doubt that there's some Russian assistance, but there's not an invasion in that sense. And we have to remember the Ukrainian general himself, a couple of days ago, I think it was last week sometime, came out and said, no, there are no Russian troops in the eastern Ukraine. This is not an invasion in any sort of classical military sense. To expect Russia to sit back, in other words, and just simply take this is wishful thinking. But now, that said, I've maintained and gone on record that I think the murder of Boris Nemtsov was perhaps a Western sponsored operation, as Russia is now claiming, for the simple reason that Mr. Putin himself really didn't have anything to gain from it. And now we're hearing Russian opposition leaders saying that, well, this was all Putin's fault and he was behind it. I am skeptical again simply because these opposition leaders may be part of this attempt now waging covert operations in Russia itself to bring about some sort of color revolution in Russia and restore the status quo ante, which was that business with Yeltsin and the favoring of the oligarchs. So that struggle, in other words, has once again come back to Russia. And as the Putin government is making it clear, they are reading this as a color revolution attempt, an attempt to oust Putin through popular demonstrations and uprising. That's the way I'm reading it as well. Now, as I've warned before, anytime you start playing covert operations like that in a major power's not only backyard, but in their front yard now, expect the same thing to happen down the line to you. Covert operations are a game that two people can play. So the West, if indeed it's behind what's going on inside of Russia right now, the West can expect some form of covert operations to be conducted in response. But that's going to be a while, and here's why. There's a geopolitical consequence to all of this, and the consequence now is coming home to roost. And this is something that now the West is going to have to figure out how to deal with. In other words, our meddling has just made things much worse. And the story is a story headlined, and I'll link these for you. Russia talks about Moscow, Beijing, high-speed rail details, and willingness to sell China 50% stakes in oil gas fields. And let me read a few paragraphs from this. Further details of the proposed high-speed railway to link Moscow and Beijing through Siberia in just 33 hours have been unveiled. The project will see a new 400 kilometers per hour line running between the capital cities in a venture that would eclipse the iconic Trans-Siberian Railway. During the Krasnoyarsk Economic Forum last week, it was revealed that two potential options for the routing of the track are being considered. Alexander Misharin, the first vice president of Russian Railways, said talks were taking place about going through either Kazakhstan or across the Altai region. The new 7,700-kilometer route will cost 1 trillion yuan, that's 240 billion US dollars, and become a link in the Eurasian land bridge, also known as the New Silk Road Economic Belt. The belt will connect China with Central Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, as well as India and Southeast Asia. In other words, this rail line will integrate the Eurasian Economic Union, and it will integrate Russia and China that much more closely. And there's another consequence, and we're going to get to that in these final two paragraphs. Russia has reversed its long-held opposition to selling foreign investors majority stakes in its strategic oil and gas fields, saying there would now be no political obstacles to allowing Chinese stockholders to hold more than 50% of the properties. Putin is currently in a tough situation, a leading official in China's oil industry told Reuters on condition of anonymity. We all know this. One of the ways to help him get out of the mess is trying to improve ties with China. The official is knowledgeable about the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation's strategy and the energy cooperation between the two countries, unquote. So in other words, what's really happened with not only the Ukraine mess, but now the assassination of Boris Nemtsov on Russian soil. And again, I'm much more suspicious of the West here than I am of Mr. Putin. What this has done is it's driven Mr. Putin even more closely into the embrace of China. And now there's talks about this railway going across Central Asia through Kazakhstan, which, as the article I just read pointed out, is going to integrate that whole Eurasian Economic Union, including China, which will be the heavyweight in that union, much more tightly together. So in other words, the rail links being developed internally will extend Chinese influence into Central Asia. And China is going to get sucked into that vacuum that the Soviet Union used to fill. And it's going to integrate India and Southeast Asia. So in other words, you're watching the creation of a huge economic bloc. And that's the very last thing that the American pivot to the Pacific has wanted, was growing Chinese power in the region. So in other words, Western policy, once again, particularly American policy, is really, again, to my mind, being counterintuitive. It's accomplishing that which we supposedly or ostensibly were against, and that was limiting the power of China and its growth in Central Asia. And now, from the sounds of it, the Russians are willing to sell the Chinese a half stake, if not majority stake, in all those developing Siberian energy fields. So in other words, Chinese influence is being extended northward into Russian Siberia. So we are accomplishing, our policy is accomplishing effectively the very opposite that it was ostensibly designed to prevent. So in other words, our meddling in the Ukraine, once again, folks, to me, speaking as an American, appears to be very, very counterintuitive. It's producing results that supposedly the United States is against. So the United States has to reconsider, in my opinion, its total foreign policy, particularly with respect to Russia. And here's the thing. If you're listening in Berlin or Paris, get a clue here. You can either be part of that bloc or you can be part of the American bloc. And in the long run, the developing economy over there is going to require Europe to move to a much more pro-Russian, pro-Chinese stance. So the insanity continues, folks. There's no other way to call it. This is geopolitical insanity. I think the United States really needs to sit down and evaluate its policy, and needs to sit down with Mr. Putin and start dealing honestly. Because if we watch this growth of Chinese power, there's going to be a much more serious situation down the line than anything posed by the Ukraine or Russia. Anyway, that's it for my news and views this week. I'm Joseph P. Farrell. I'll see everybody on the flip side, and God bless.